Hello watch enthusiasts. Now, as is the case every month, I'd like to talk about 5 vintage watches which I've found particularly interesting on the vintage market, and which offer a great deal to the buyer. And this month I've tried to focus on having a watch really for every group, so everything really from those who are very much into their luxury horology and into their interesting movements, and also to those who are just getting into the world of the vintage watch and want something as a stepping stone or an interesting piece to sort of to build their knowledge with. And of course this is how I start with this rather attractive Doxa, and indeed a number of other watches made by the brand, especially at the low end of the price point. However, before I begin the video, I would like to encourage you all to join the Watch Guys, which is my group on Snups, which is the social media platform for sharing pictures of your collections and interests, and where you can discuss matters of horology with myself and other enthusiasts, and where I'll do my utmost to reply to any questions or video requests you happen to give me. Therefore, I would strongly encourage you to follow the link down below and download the app, which is available for iOS or Android, depending on what you're using, and join the 500 or so other people in the group for these added features, which I really do feel will allow people to get the most out of the channel, and indeed in terms of asking any questions you happen to have. Now, the first watches I'd like to talk about are from Doxa. And Doxa are a brand which is most commonly known, and indeed today only produce watches from the Sub line. And this was founded by the Sub 300 in 1967. But prior to that, they produced rather interesting dress watches in a number of formats, and are specifically interesting because they produced a lot of watches in larger sizes which weren't approached by more luxurious brands. And this makes them very attractive to a new buyer of vintage watches, who wants to try the waters, if you will, of the vintage market without the concerns of spending a fortune, and also buying a watch which is fairly robust and resilient. Now, in terms of styling, these watches do come in a great many different formats, and there are versions in steel, gold, and for lower prices also plated models. Now, it's worth noting that a lot of these Doxas will be a base metal that's plated, though due to their low price I'm going to overlook that for the simple reason that you can get models which are nearly unused and with extremely well preserved dials and hands, which again adds to the value of these timepieces. And the detailing on these watches really is quite beautiful, with very flowing lines across the cases of these primarily dress-orientated watches. And again, one has a lot of soft white hues on the dials, as well as cream dials being very popular in the era of the 40s and 50s, from which point these watches tend to come. And the pricing for these watches tends to sit between £150 and £300, which again, for what you're getting, is quite remarkable. The movements inside these watches tend to be fairly basic movements of the era, general Swiss movements, and not specific to Doxa. And these do depend on the watch, but you can't really be terribly picky, especially at this price point, because in truth the movements are very often bought in and have been adjusted and serviced over the years, so originality isn't very easy to certify on these watches. Though I must say a lot of the movements are clearly very easily serviced due to their fairly simple 17-jewel architecture. And as a result of this, these do make watches which are quite interesting if you're looking for a timepiece which is a vintage piece, but that you intend to wear quite regularly, not necessarily as a daily piece, but certainly as a watch that will remain in rotation. And this means that you can have a watch which is relatively easily serviceable, and also which you don't have to worry about too much, whereas with a lot of vintages, you do have to be very, very careful. Whereas at the price point these watches sit at, they can be a very nice entry point for someone who's interested in exploring the vintage market, but who doesn't want to stake thousands and thousands of pounds on a watch which they're unsure of. And of course, one benefit of these watches is that you are getting a completely Swiss watch, because in that era there was very little movement in terms of imports of movements, and indeed cases. So you are getting a watch which truly is a Swiss watch in the most traditional of senses, which I think is quite remarkable for £150 to £300, especially when you consider the fact that these weren't by any stretch budget watches in their day, but rather were competing with the mid-tier watches, not quite with the Omegas and the Rolexes of the era, but nonetheless they were certainly showing themselves to be very attractive mid-range watches, which they certainly seem to remain to this day. The next watch I'd like to talk about is a variant of the Seiko 6139, and this is the 6139-8000 line of models, so the 8020 for instance. And the reason why I'd like to talk about these watches, despite the fact that I mentioned them in one of these very videos a few months ago, is because in recent months these have made a real comeback in terms of pricing. A few months ago they were very, very difficult to come by for any less than £400 or £500, but now they're available for between £200 and £300, making them incredibly good deals, considering you're getting the first automatic chronograph movement from any brand that was available on the market. Now, of course, the El Primero movement from Zenith was developed sooner, though this movement was released to the market earlier, and in my eyes therefore makes this the first of its type available. And of course the versions available are very varied, from the Pogue model, which has become very, very famous. It's the 6139-6000 line. But these are slightly thicker and feature a more cluttered dial, which I feel doesn't really appeal to as many buyers, and at least in my eyes does contribute to the pricing of these watches because they're so much more well known, which makes these watches, the 8000 line, particularly interesting to a buyer who wants a piece of history but who doesn't want to spend a few £100s and rather would like to stay in the relatively low price point of £200 to £300 while still getting all the history and indeed the very interesting style of this timepiece. Now, integral to the design of this watch is that very 70s style of tonneau case, and the whole case rolls over the sides, as you can see, which means that you do have an area to change the strap and put the watch on really any strap you see fit, which fits, though you will have these hooded lugs, which means that you won't see that central space as you would with a normal watch, which I feel to lovers of that era really does appeal, especially when combined with the fantastically contrasted second run around the edge of the dial. You also get that fantastically well-designed dial, which gives you a brilliant legibility with different layers of loomed indices, as well as those fantastic baton-style hands, and those very, very clear chronograph hands which match in terms of shape, and on certain models also match in colour. To the right-hand side of the dial at 3 o'clock, you also see the day-date complication, which again is a functional and very helpful feature for those using these watches. And due to the fact the movements tend to be very robust, they tend to work even to this day. And servicing isn't too difficult, albeit you will have to go and find a service centre with the correct parts for this timepiece. And of course, in terms of functionality with regards to the crown and pushers, the pushers are very, very easily manipulated, and that is one area where you have to be quite careful, because they can be bent easily. There's a small price to pay for the ease of use. As well as this, the crown is sunken into the case, which makes it very, very well protected from the elements, and indeed from any bumps or knocks that it may be subject to if it was sticking out. So this really does show that Seiko really did put a great deal of care into this timepiece, with those layered dials and those fantastic complications, whilst keeping a clear and legible layout. Of course, the most well-known aspect of this watch is its namesake, which is the movement, which is named in the same way as the watch, with 6139 being its reference. And this is, as I've said, the first automatic chronograph movement available to the market, with a column wheel engagement, as well as a very well-designed automatic winding section, which makes this 17-jewel movement a remarkably interesting piece for someone who is interested in curious calibers and ones which played a major role. And this watch may not be the perfect watch for a daily use, because in truth these are watches which are 40 plus years old, which does make them remarkably susceptible to wear and the elements. So I wouldn't recommend wearing these watches every day or in any testing sort of conditions. But as far as an interesting chronograph to wear simply to work or in the office, this is really a tremendous option for those who want something a bit different from the usual options for this price point, or even someone who would be in the market for a Speedmaster or something of that nature, who wants something on the side which is a little bit different, and offers a slightly different flavour to that traditional vibe of a chronograph. The next watch I'd like to talk about is a piece from Longines. And this is the Conquest, but the 60s and 70s model, not the very famous 1950s version, which we all know and love, and has been recreated and rekindled in the form of the Heritage model. And I myself own the Heritage model, but in terms of the vintage versions, I would say that the later 60s and 70s Conquests offer a fantastic option for people who want a timepiece for daily wear. And the reason for this is that these pieces, unlike the original, offer a great deal more resilience to the elements with thicker lugs, more interesting finishes in terms of being resistant to scratches, and also generally have much easier to service movements, which make this watch a far more attractive option for a daily timepiece than the original. Now, through the 60s and 70s, the cases of these watches moved from the very thin cases with the very delicate lugs, all in polished steel, through to a far more contemporary design, which I feel is more appropriate for everyday wear. And these feature both sunburst brushing on their cases, as well as styles of cases which curve over more and have more of a unity of form than the originals, which again is an area where these watches I feel really do shine and demonstrate their strengths, because they provide you with a watch which is clearly very legible, and also which more often than not has a dial in better condition due to better waterproofing on these pieces, but also the movements used in these watches, the 6.9, 5.2 and 4.2 models, which are far, far more reliable. Now, whilst talking about the movements, it's worth noting that these have a fairly basic architecture, with a simple manually wound structure, and a very conventional design, and don't have the high beat setup of the Ultrachron models, which cost a little bit more than these watches, at about £450, whilst these remain between £250 and £350. And the reason why I feel these quite possibly offer more to the average buyer is that the Ultrachron models, though they offer these tremendous movements, which are, in my eyes at least, a fantastic feat of engineering for the price, but do have a bad habit of, as a lot of watch repairers say, consuming themselves. And that's where they wear themselves down far, far more quickly than the equivalent movement with a lower beat rate. And so as a result, for a daily wearer of these watches, it may well be a better option to go for a movement which runs at a lower beat rate, such as these ones, and is far, far more easily serviced, and will last much, much longer between services and have longer service intervals. Of course, though these watches don't have the delicate lines of the 50s models, their dials are truly beautiful, and there are some really wonderful looking dials out there, with everything from sunburst dials with applied numerals, through to far, far more matted dials, with again applied numerals in a similarly matte style, which gives a very subdued air and a very, very elegant and in my eyes, very refined look to these watches, which I feel wasn't necessarily harnessed by the earlier models, which have a far, far more flamboyant look, which won't necessarily appeal to everyone. And that does make these watches, from an aesthetic standpoint at least, extremely versatile, and can be worn with really a suit, or indeed a t-shirt and jeans at the weekend. So as a result, these make really brilliant buys and easily serviced and maintained pieces for those who want a vintage watch but don't want to have something that they have to take out on special occasions. Now, the penultimate watch in this list is quite a curious one, because it allows you to have a watch from a reputable brand, but really from their heyday, their glory era of the 1960s. And Hamilton through the 50s and 60s were very much at the top of their game, being a high-end brand from America, producing a great deal of very interesting watches, and known for their electric watches, but their super compressors have also become rather reputable, as far as very interesting dive watches for a reasonable price, with a very interesting history. And this is the Hamilton Aquadate, or often known as the super compressor quite simply, and more often called the super compressor, because it has a brevet style of case, which means that the crowns have been certified to be pushed in by the pressure of surrounding water, as well as the case back as it descends to depth, making it more water resistant as pressure increases, and further meaning that the crowns can actually be manipulated underwater without any concern for water ingress. The case of this watch is fully polished and in stainless steel, which I think does add to the fairly dressy aspect of this watch with its cream dial, albeit originally white, but on most models you can get hold of it will have turned to a very rich cream. But also we have these very nicely faceted hands which are loomed and very, very legible, albeit loomed from that era being radium based won't be legible today. It certainly does give a nice aesthetic to this watch, which in a strange way is reminiscent of the dial of, for example, the Seiko Marine Master 300. And of course the bezel is internal and is painted black with metallic accents, and is manipulated by the top crown, which, as I've said, doesn't screw in but rather presses in under pressure. The 36mm case of this watch may appear small compared to the 37mm, for example, of the Longines Conquest I showed you, and the 41 of the Seiko 6139. But in truth, with those very large supercompressor crowns which assure a 200-metre water resistance, albeit today that may be questionable, and I would recommend having the watch tested, resealed, and checked to see if it is in fact possible to bring its water resistance back to its original specification. But in truth, this actually wears remarkably large for its size due to those crowns, as I've said, and the relatively long lugs, which make it stretch across the wrist very comfortably for pretty much every wrist size, and brings it up to the wear of really a 40mm timepiece. And the movement inside this watch is the calibre, well, it's an ETA base 2452, albeit Hamilton give it their own name. And this is again very easily serviced because it is one of these stock movements, albeit an old one, and so no parts are really interchangeable with modern movements. Certainly they can be acquired, and I shouldn't think this will be too difficult to service for the vast majority of reputable service centres. Now, the pricing of this watch varies greatly, because for a model with a fairly discoloured dial with a number of blotches on it and a somewhat oxidised hands and marks on the case, you'll be paying about £1,300. And this seems fairly reasonable in my eyes, considering the fact that these watches are very rare and remarkably exclusive in terms of their numbers made. And of course, similarly, the originality of the watch will also be defined by this. So I would stay away from refinished dials, for instance. I would rather go for a used and a well-worn dial than a heavily refinished one, just for the sake of originality. However, for a model in really tremendous condition, with a completely unmarked dial, fantastic operation of the movement, and relatively flawless case, you'll be looking at just over £2,000, which again is fairly reasonable when you consider the price, for example, today, of getting hold of a Longines Conquest Heritage, which doesn't have the history of this watch in terms of its piece in itself, yet will cost about £1,600 on some markets. And so as a result, I feel this is a fantastic buy for someone who wants a piece of diving history and something a bit different to a modern and conventional dive watch. The final watch I'd like to talk about are Omega Seamaster chronographs from the 1960s. Now, there are two variants, really, of these in terms of the style. Of course, there are solid gold, gold-plated, and steel versions, though in this video I'm addressing primarily the steel, and if you're that way inclined, the gold-plated model. And there's the standard Seamaster, which features these beautiful arrow-style hands, or alpha-style hands, which have become extremely popular on Speedmasters of the early era. And these ones are more sought after, because these feature this beautiful style of having tachymeter built into the dial, with a shared luxurious aspect of the Seamaster, with the raw functionality of the Speedmaster, with loomed hands, albeit the loom will no longer function at this age, and with, more crucially, the calibre 321, being an absolutely iconic movement from Omega, and is of course the movement which took Omega to the moon, which is the reason why it's such an impressive and an important movement. And this of course features the usual layout of having the seconds on the left-hand side of the dial, the running seconds in the centre, the chronograph minutes on the right, and at the bottom the chronograph hours. And of course that's remained the same until today on the vast majority of Omega movements, but this showcases a watch with the original movement in a price bracket which is far lower than the equivalent Speedmaster. Now the second version of the watch available is the DeVille version, which features much simpler hands, more baton-style hands, and a generally simplified aesthetic, and these come in during the late 1960s, rather than the early 60s versions with the alpha hands. And these tend to cost a little bit less, and the price point for these watches is really from £2,500 to £3,000. And this makes them very accessible for someone who is already in the luxury market, but who wants a 321 calibre without spending the money required for a Speedmaster, which would easily be 3 or 4 times the price of this watch. Which does raise the question of why are the Speedmasters so expensive. And in truth, it's really down to the image of the Speedmaster, but certainly these offer a great deal to the person who enjoys an interesting movement. Of course, the 321 has gained its popularity not just because of the fact that this was the movement which took Omega to the moon, but also because this was the movement that was first ever available in the original Speedmaster, and so as a result has gained a great deal of attention as a really very impressive movement with a column wheel engagement, which is an area which the original Speedmasters had, and which the original Seamasters also in this case had, but which is no longer the case in more modern movements such as the 861 or the 1861, which use a cam operation. And as a result, this has raised this movement to a status of prestige, and as a result, even today, it's heavily revered and seen as one of the greatest chronograph movements ever made, especially due to the fact that it was designed to be a fairly simple racing chronograph movement, and yet is now one of the most rugged vintage movements there are. Of course, even ignoring the movement, these are truly beautiful timepieces with fantastic proportions, which of course follow the lines of the thick-lugged Seamasters of the 1960s, and offer an aesthetic which I feel is lost really in later Seamasters, especially in their chronograph and DeVille styles. And so as a result, I feel these watches offer a brilliant blend between the dressy aspects of, for example, a Constellation or a conventional three-hand Seamaster, and the functionality of having a Speedmaster with that tachymeter and those wonderful subdials. And of course the dials of these watches have aged with various patches, but in many cases these dials do appear far more in far more original condition than others, because a lot of the refinished ones do sell for lower prices or have been sold in parts, which again does reduce their value. So often you do find pieces with aged dials, but certainly I would prefer this to a refinished one. Anyway, I'll conclude the video here, but I hope you enjoyed this video and found it interesting in terms of offering you a bit of information on several watches which I find to be excellent value this month on the vintage market. So thank you very much for watching, and please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to enjoy more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.